Okay, good. I'm glad that didn't.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Robert Swartwood here. Tonight, I am joined by the New York Times bestselling author of over a dozen books, including her most recent thriller, Hooked. That's right, it's your favorite writer of mine, Caitlin Rother. Caitlin, how the heck are you?
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're here obviously to talk about your new book, Hooked, which congratulations, that just recently came out. It was Amazon first read. So technically, this is the first month or last, or when was it the official pub date?
February was the
February.
official
Okay.
release, yes, but it
Okay,
came out
so
in
it's been out
January.
now over a month. So okay, great. And then obviously we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about I guess the follow-up because this is a series. So you do have a second book that's going to be out in only a couple months.
Right.
So we're going to talk about all that. But usually when I talk to authors, I always try to just we're going to go way back. This is almost like therapy for you, some free
Okay.
therapy session. But like, do you remember the very first creative thing you did, like if it was a story, poem, drawing, just does anything stick in your mind that the very like
Yes,
first creative
actually,
thing you did?
because this is kind of a funny story. So in the first grade, we were basically told to write a book. So we brought material, fabric from home, so we could make a hardcover book and put fabric on the outside. And I wrote a story about a family of mice who lived in the forest, and I killed off the mother essentially. And my mother was very upset and troubled by this because she didn't understand why I was killing off the mother. And I said, well, what's the point of having a story if nobody dies? So and I illustrated it myself, by the way, with colored pencils. So that was my first book in the first grade. So I was already writing crime stories when I was very young.
What year did I mean, was Bambi out by that point? Because I know like a lot of
I
Disney
don't
movies
know.
that they dealt a lot with a lot of, dead mothers in Disney movies.
Huh. I don't know that I loved watching cartoon movies, so I can't say that I didn't watch any of those, but I don't
Okay.
remember. I used to read like Grimm's fairy tales and,
Mm,
kind of dark.
yeah, that
Both of
will
my
do
parents
it.
have PhDs in literature, so we had a lot of books in the house, and you
Do you
know,
still have that book?
which one? The one that I wrote?
Yeah.
No, I don't know where that is. I hope my mom has it because I always talk about it. I wish it had like a orange paisley cover. It was really cool.
Okay, so that was you said first grade.
First grade.
Uh, was
I
that
read a
something you
lot.
continued throughout like the school? You would do stories or I mean, I guess at what point did things start to become a little bit more real in terms of, oh, this is something I could, possibly do as a career?
I was mostly a reader. I read a ton of library books because I was an only child, and I've always been an introvert. Kind of didn't was shy, and so I would read. I would just read a lot of books, and I would talk to myself because I was an only child, and do voices and stuff. So I guess I always kind of had that in my head. And then later on, I think I wrote a short story, but probably not until um, college. So I
What
don't
type of
remember. I mean,
books?
I was always a good writer, but
Yeah.
I didn't make things up necessarily, like fiction. I was more just writing essays or book reports or whatever we had to do for school.
So what type of books were you starting? Like, do you remember in like middle school, high school, what type of books you found yourself reading more of? Like, is a certain genre or certain authors?
I don't remember honestly. I just would grab like 10 books and bring them home, and I would read them all, and I'd make a list and check them off because it was like an accomplishment to have finished a book. And I remember reading a lot of I honestly I don't remember what my taste was at the time. But I mean, in college, I remember even though I didn't have to read books for the classes I was taking, I would read in addition to all the work I had to do for all my classes. I would continue to read classics, fiction. I remember reading Jerzy Kaczynski. I remember reading, um, all kinds of stuff because I when you have two parents who have or English literature PhDs and you have a lot of books in the house, and I was almost like trying not to read books because my dad would tell me to read books, so I kind of didn't want to, but I did. And then I didn't really start writing until I took a creative writing class in college, and then I started writing for the newspaper, like my very last semester at Berkeley.
So when you went into college, what was the initial plan? Did you declare a
I didn't really
major?
have a plan. I
Okay.
was going to be like maybe a therapist, maybe a nutritionalist. I didn't really know, a teacher. I kind of was not really sure what I was going to do, or I didn't have a plan. I
Right.
honestly did. I never would have guessed that I would have ended up here ever.
Yeah. Well, so on your website, you do list that your very first book was Naked Addiction. Was that the very first? And that was not the first book published. That was the first book that you wrote. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
Had you written anything prior to that? Like I think like maybe a short story, like, or had you written a novel that maybe you didn't finish?
Was the product of being in writing workshops for a year. And, they do a trigger exercise and you'd end up with a little germ. And I put a bunch of those germs together and it ended up being diary entries for a character that I murdered in Naked Addiction. And so it kind of came out of writing workshops. And then I created, that was my first novel. And then stubbornly, as opposed to some people who write multiple novels and put them in a drawer when they don't turn out right, I just kept rewriting the same one over and over and over and over again until I finally got it published. It took 17 years.
But before that, you started doing, correct me if I'm wrong, you started doing like journalism stuff as well?
I did. I was writing journalism for newspapers, and then actually my first journalism job was the Berkshire Eagle in Berkshire County, Massachusetts. And then I went to another newspaper where I worked part time, and I was writing short stories at that time before I'd go to work, but I could never get any of them published.
What type of genre short stories? Were these crime or literary or other
I
type of
was trying to
thing?
do literary, but I would send them to journals and they got rejected. So I eventually realized that I probably was more of a commercial writer. I got into Bread Loaf based on excerpts of Naked Addiction. So I kind of thought, well, I guess I'm a literary writer if they let me into Bread Loaf. And then none of the literary agents who did literary fiction wanted to represent me because they said, what you write isn't what we do. So I'm a commercial fiction writer and a commercial nonfiction writer. That's what I've learned.
So you mentioned your parents being like,
It's
I
like
don't want to
therapy.
be
Oh my
I don't
God.
want to be very personal here, but like were they kind of, very stuffy, like you have to read
Yeah.
like,
Well,
like a Raymond Carver and like John Cheever type stuff, or is like were they open-minded about like, oh, this Stephen King has some good books?
no, I wouldn't say they would be open to Stephen King. They were into the classics, and my father was the kind of professor who they wrote literary criticism. So he
Mm,
wrote a number of journal articles in order to get promoted. And I always like to say he would write these extremely long sentences. He would put Latin in them, and there would be like, maybe five people who could really understand what he was really saying. And the sentences were extremely long. So he's a very different kind of writer than me.
yeah.
So,
So you had worked as a journalist, and eventually, again, on your website, you have a very interesting bio page in that, and I don't know if this is the journalist in you, but a lot of like bullet points down, as opposed
yeah,
to like a couple long paragraphs or whatever else. You get to
right.
the boom, boom, boom. But your first published book was Poison Love. Now, before that, I do want to talk about that, but like, how long had you been a journalist? Like, again, like when was the idea to maybe start? You had worked on the novel in college, but like I don't know, like you did a lot of like nonfiction books. Like how did that book come about? Like how far into your journalism career before that opportunity arose?
So I'm trying to get Naked Addiction published, and I didn't start that until after grad school. So I didn't write that until after I took writing workshops while I was a journalist. So I
Hmm.
didn't start that in college.
Oh, okay, for sorry,
Um,
I thought you did like the creative writing classes in college. So
I
this was
did,
after
but
college.
that was long after
Right,
that.
right,
Yeah.
right. Okay.
So and I couldn't get it published. I kept trying and I'd go to conferences, I'd meet editors, I'd send it to them. They would make comments, I would rewrite it, send it back to them. I would try to get an agent. It just went on and on and on, and I couldn't get that published. So I finally said, well, rather than banging my head against the wall, maybe I should try writing nonfiction since that's what I do for a living. So I came across this case that I wrote about for my job, the Kristen Rossum case. She's a beautiful young toxicologist who worked at the medical examiner's office in San Diego County, and I covered her case from arrest to sentencing. And I got a story in Cosmopolitan magazine, which I'd always been trying to do. They solicited a story for me, and I was really excited. It went to the international editions. So once I got that done, I did a proposal and was able to sell a book based on that case. So that was my first book that was published, and it did really well. So I don't think I'd be where I am today if that book hadn't done so well. It's just because everybody loves a pretty murderer, because, can't judge a book by its cover kind of thing. So she was a meth addict, basically. You would never know that she was a murderer. She's just this pretty little thing. Meanwhile, she's smoking meth in the lab at the medical examiner's office, because they had this machine that she would work on that had a vent, so she could smoke crack and meth in the lab, and it would just go up, right? No one would know, because they found a glass pipe in her drawer with her DNA on it. So that's how they knew that she was smoking in the lab. So anyway, it's a story about this young toxicologist who was having an affair with her boss. Both of them were married, and her husband ended up dead. Acute fentanyl intoxication. And these were in the days when fentanyl was not available like it is today. You couldn't get fentanyl. It was very controlled. And so she was basically convicted of poisoning her husband, staging a suicide scene, sprinkling red rose petals over his body, and claiming that he had killed himself because she was leaving him. So that was my first book, Poison Love, and it just did really well. And then I was on my way, and I didn't want to stop writing books because it was so much fun.
So how did you know? I mean, I'm assuming for like a nonfiction book like that, you have to have a certain, they're not doing like nonfiction novellas. They have to be at least probably what, 300 pages. Like, how did you know that you would have enough? I mean, like this was your first, I guess, nonfiction book. So, and I'm assuming you had read other like nonfiction books. I mean, like, how does one approach writing something like a true crime account like this? And also, do you have to get like permission from the families? You know what I mean? Like how does that work if you're writing specifically about somebody's focusing on life to like worry about that and like later you're not going to get sued or anything like that?
Right. So this was in the day before we had the true crime craze that we had, that's been going on for quite some time, with all of these TV documentaries, investigation, discovery, all this stuff bombarding us with all of these crime shows. It didn't used to be like this. And in fact, true crime was kind of a dirty little secret that people didn't want to admit. And it took a while for me to ever get any respect for even writing these books. So I had actually never, well, that's not true. I had read a few probably true crime books just for fun, not because I was planning to write one. The main reason I wrote that book is because I couldn't get my crime novel published. I wanted to be a crime novelist. That's what I really wanted to do. And I said, well, if I can't do that, okay, I'll write this book that's nonfiction. And it's such a great story. I hope I can get this published. And it was such a great story that I was able to get it published. And so, no, you do not need permission from the family to write about it, but it's really good to have their cooperation if you can get it, because you do have to get photos and you do have to get permission to use photos. And over time, it's gotten more and more restrictive. So in fact, you have to get them to sign waivers, even if there's somebody in a photo, let alone copyright permission. So it's got
So
to
to
the
be clear,
point
like
where,
if someone's at like a picnic and it's them, but there's like 10 people in the background, you have to get the permission from all those 10 different people.
well, you probably don't use that photo anyway because
Well,
you really just want
yeah, I
one
mean, you don't want to
person.
make things harder on yourself, right?
But
Right.
yeah, I mean, there have been times when I've had to like block out people's faces because we
Mm.
don't have their permission to, even if there's just two people in the photo and I want to use the other person, but that's the only photo I have. I literally, and I can't really crop it, otherwise I'll mess up the person I want. Yeah, sometimes we have to literally white out the face of the other person, because a lot of people don't want to be in these books. They don't, for privacy reasons. And it didn't used to be like that when I started out. It's gotten more and more that way. It's gotten more and more restrictive. So I had initially had her parents' cooperation, but then after a certain point, they were interviewed. They were on 48 Hours. They were on Dateline, I think. There were a bunch of shows that focused on this case. And I covered the trial. I was there every day. And I went through the court exhibits. I got all the stuff. It was my story. And then somebody beat me to it. Actually, there was another author who wrote some quick hit book without ever going to the trial, which took a bite out of my market. But I did it, and I have the authoritative, comprehensive version of that story. And it sold really well right away. So I was able to keep doing books. So yeah, and that's how I got my first agent, was because it was a good story. And she didn't even want to do true crime, but she recognized that it was a good story, a
And then from
marketable
that, were you
story.
able then to get your first novel then published, like on the success of that
My
first,
novel was
or?
number 4. Yes, it took another 3 books. That was my 4th book that was published. So I wrote another couple of true crimes, and in the process, we had also sent out the novel, and that finally came through. So we got that published, and it didn't do very well. So
So was that published? So my understanding, it was published by Dorchester, right? Was that Leisure
yes,
Books?
was that Leisure Books?
Was it Leisure Books? Because I know that back, at least I
I
feel like
It
Leisure
might have been.
did.
It's been so long. Yeah, it might have been.
Yeah,
And then
because
they
Leisure did
went
a lot of
belly
like
up.
crime, horror, romance, westerns. It was the mass
Yeah,
market paperbacks
yeah,
that
mass market
were.
paperbacks. Yeah.
Um, so at that point, had you written any other novels, or you were still tinkering just with that first novel?
I wrote that first novel, and then as soon as that one got accepted and was published, I started trying to write a sequel, which actually was supposed to be Hooked. So the first version of Hooked was the sequel to that book. But then the publisher didn't want it. They said, you took too long. And I don't think that was really the reason, because I really didn't take that long. It got, a lot of them got returned because Poison Love did so well. Barnes and Noble ordered a ton of Naked Addiction, and they got returned because I was not known for fiction. I didn't know how to
Yeah.
market it, and people didn't buy it, and I got burned. And so I spent the next 19 years working on the sequel, but it was not really the sequel anymore. It was a new series because I created a new main character to go with the detective. So it could be its own series so that I could sell it to a different publisher. Because, you can't keep going with one series and break it and go to a different publisher in the middle, right? They don't do that. So it's a
Yeah.
new series. And so Naked Addiction is now the prequel.
Yeah. Yeah, publishing is crazy. I always say that,
Yes.
mostly, publishing is an awful business. The only reason people stay in it is because they love writing, they love telling
Yes.
stories, because it is just
Yes.
crazy stuff like that.
I
For
know.
whatever reason, I'm just thinking about this author who is somewhat well known still now, but I think her very first book was supposed to come out as a hardcover, but I think it was Walmart didn't really care for the cover. And so instead of changing the cover, the publisher decided to just release it as a mass market paperback. And
Okay.
that was her first, you know what I mean? It was like just like weird things like that. Like other authors,
Yeah.
they might have a book come out and then, but like it doesn't do as well, or maybe it does too well. And then and then the bookstore orders more copies than they should. And there's more. Yeah.
Yes.
It's these things that are completely out of people's controls that is
Yep.
very maddening because, yeah. So anyway, okay. So do you find that it's difficult or is it easy to kind of flip back and forth then because you've written, the nonfiction and fiction? Do you find because I'm assuming you're using kind of like different parts of your brain when you're telling very, fact-oriented narratives versus just, making shit up.
I write for my nonfiction, I write narrative nonfiction, which is basically using fiction storytelling techniques to tell a true story. So I write fiction using fiction storytelling techniques with stuff I make up. So the only thing I'm using in terms of having a different part of my brain is, yes, I have to do a tremendous amount of research for the nonfiction, and I already know what happens. And so I know how to structure a book now. But with fiction, I'm making stuff up, right? And I have to plot things, and I have to make it exciting and keep the pacing in suspense and not give it away too soon. But I had a lot of practice. So I didn't really know what I was doing with Naked Addiction in terms of police procedures and what have you, because I didn't really know my material well enough. So my lesson from that is, just because you're writing fiction doesn't mean you can just go ahead and make stuff up, because if you don't know what you're talking about, you can't make it up and have it be believable and realistic. So I now can pull from all of my experience from writing a dozen true crime books and all these homicide cases that I covered, for books from beginning to end. Now I know how detectives think, and I know what the protocols are and what order they do the investigations and how they talk and, how they treat suspects. And now I can put that into my fiction and it comes out much better. So the only thing that's different really about in using different parts of my brain is that one is I have to do a lot of research and be an investigator. And in the fiction, I don't really have to do that because most of the material that I'm drawing from is already in my head. But that's only because I have all that experience of writing all those other books.
Yeah, so as a journalist, do you find, because especially when you're a journalist, you usually, I mean, not usually, you always have to write under deadline. You have to have an article done by a certain time, and usually has to be a certain length too. It's not like you could just, spend 2,000 words on something. You have to kind of keep things concise. So do you find that helped translate to when you were writing books? Do you feel that you're like a quicker writer, that maybe you're even a tighter writer? Because I think like Michael Connolly has talked about how that really helped him when he was switching over, having been a journalist. He was able to write fast. He was able to write kind of like tight. Like, did you find the same, or was that an adjustment?
When I was a reporter and I was writing stories for the newspaper, I was pretty fast because I had to write a lot of stories and I had to write them quickly on deadline. So I was writing like a column inch a minute on deadline. So, and because I had to write so many stories, yes. So I became pretty fast as a writer in general. And the only problem with journalism, though, is your writing may not be that good. It's very simple because you want people to understand what you're saying and you use simple words, and that's not great writing sometimes. So what the challenge is now is I want to have my sentences be a little more artful and have some more metaphors maybe, and have some more pretty sentences than you probably would in journalism. So yeah, I can write really fast, and I've gotten to the point now where I can write a first draft of a novel in 2 months. And so there's no more of the 17, 19 years of rewriting books anymore. I have finally got it down. So I was fast before, but if it's no good, it doesn't matter how many words you write and how fast.
Yeah.
So, I think I've learned more of the craft and what words to use and in what order and
Yeah.
the structure of the book and the plot. That is the challenging part now, is to make a really good plot, which I didn't have to
Well,
do with nonfiction because I already knew what happened. And, I
right.
would dole out the suspense, and I would still write them so that you would learn things along the way. And I would do research and learn new things and be able to give the reader new information that they thought they knew the story, but then they read the book and go, oh, I thought I knew this case, but I didn't know it at all. That was what I was going for. But with the thrillers now, I'm going for character development, and I'm going for suspense, and I'm going for surprises, kind of different goals.
So when you were writing Naked Addiction, was did you outline that? Did you just sit down and start writing?
No.
And has that process changed over the course?
Yes,
Because I'm assuming that with nonfiction books, you really kind of do have to have an outline to
absolutely.
know,
Yes.
because again, you
Yes.
know where your end point is, whereas opposed to usually
Right.
with a novel, you might not necessarily know where it ends, or maybe you do. Like, how has that changed over the course of, since you started?
Well, with Naked Addiction, like I said, I rewrote it a million times, and I rewrote the first chapter a million times. I rewrote the first 100 pages a million times. And then later on, once I realized it wasn't working, I would put a new chapter one. So all that time that I spent rewriting chapter one to make it perfect and couldn't move forward, bad idea. I learned from that. I also did not plot out the story. And that is not something I would do now. Now I absolutely plot it out, and I may not stick to it, and I will improve on it, and it's more organic. But I definitely feel like I need to know where I'm going. And as John Irving, I heard him say in a podcast, you need to know what your ending is. You need to know where you're going when you start the story, or it's not, it's not going to be any good. You need, your characters have to follow your arc, and you have to get them to that end point. That and not everybody does that. They're the pantsers, and so they seem to think that they can just pull it out of their whatever. But I like to plot, and I do come up with an ending, and it may not be the final ending because maybe I'll say, you know what, that's not good enough. I need some more twists and some more turns, and so maybe I'll add 5 more endings, and I'll, first, second one, I'll go, well, that's not good enough either. And the third one, I mean, that's not good enough. You know what I mean? So I definitely plot it out though. And I'm, so, you run into a problem and you got to work it through. And you're like, I can spend 3 days walking around the block trying to figure out how to get get to the next place in the story, even though I've
Yeah.
plotted it, even though I've outlined it.
So when you're typically in the middle of writing a book, do you usually set a goal to try to write like 1,000 words a day, a chapter a day, 500? I mean, what is a successful writing, or what would you consider a successful writing day for you? And I guess I'm sure that changes book by book, but because I know like Walter Mosley will say, sometimes just thinking about writing, just thinking about the story, thinking about the characters, like that's writing. It doesn't necessarily have
It
to be your
is.
butt in the seat typing or whatever else. Like
Right.
there's different aspects of writing.
Well, with a nonfiction book, the process for me was very different. So I kind of worked out in my mind how much time I needed for a book, and I usually gave myself 9 months, but that was maybe 6 months after doing a lot of research in order to write a very detailed proposal in order to sell the idea of the book and get a contract. I did not want to write a true crime book without a contract. Um, so I would basically spend maybe the first 3 months of my 9 months continuing to do research, because I think if you start trying to write your story too soon, you're just going to have to rewrite it, because I'm still learning things. I'm still researching. I'm still gathering information. And I'm a very meticulous researcher. And I need to have a ton of information before I feel confident that I know where the story should start and how to structure it. And I do, and in that case, I do follow the outline pretty closely. And then I'll add new stuff, because when I do research, I always find out a lot of new information that I didn't even know existed. So, and in the case of Down to the Bone, which I was my last true crime book that came out last year, I didn't get the discovery materials, investigative reports, interview transcripts with witnesses. Or the trial transcripts. I didn't get those until 4 months before my deadline. And I ended up adding 60,000 words to a 90,000 word manuscript. And then I had to cut it by 40 something thousand words all in 4 months and still get it in, still have it be accurate, still have it flow and read well. So, I mean, every book is different. But then with fiction, the process is totally different. And I will have a successful day if I have a cappuccino of 6 or 7 thousand words, because I go nuts. But I'll also be happy if I only get a 2,000 words. But I have to
Yeah.
be careful because I get injured. So I can, some days it kind of just depends. I have to listen to my body. But if I'm going, I just usually let myself go. And then the next day I don't do anything because my brain is fried. But
Yeah.
yeah, so if I can write 6,000 words in one day, great, but that's not typical.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting.
Sometimes I
Going
don't know
back,
where I'm going yet. I mean, sometimes I run into a plot problem and I can't write anymore until I figure it out. No matter how
yeah,
much I want to write, I'm stuck.
yeah. So it's interesting in terms of like, again, going back to the business end of things. Usually a novel, you have to write the novel to try to sell it. Whereas opposed to,
Yes.
I'm assuming most times like people are not buying nonfiction or true crime books on spec. Like you basically have to kind of pitch that, right? It kind of, I guess, in a
Well,
way, it's nicer because
you don't want to write the book in advance, because what if they don't want you to write it that way? I've had
right,
editors who have bought a book proposal. I haven't written the book yet, but I've written a book proposal that's really detailed. And they're like, yeah, we gave you the contract and you quit your job, but we decided we don't want it to read like you put in your book proposal. We want this other thing. And I'm like, what you
yeah,
bought? That's not what I had in mind. Oh no, that's what we want. So then I have to fight him on that. That happened one time. Another time I wrote a book, and then the editor, decided she didn't like the last 7 chapters. She didn't like the ending. She didn't think it was good enough. And I was like, okay. So I had to do all new interviews and new research and write new ones. So it doesn't even matter sometimes how much time you put into your proposal. So that's why you don't write the book first.
yeah. So let's talk a little bit.
But with fiction, you have to write the book first.
Yeah, I know it would be great to, eventually some writers get to a place where they can just kind of do a pitch and
And
they're
do a
like, okay,
summary.
great, go ahead
Yes.
and write it. But
Yes.
for most writers, they want to see the entire book,
Right.
and then usually quibble about little things here and there and be like, no, we can't publish it because whatever else. Again, publishing is awful. Let's talk about My Life Deleted. How did that come about?
That's the one I was talking about where the editor said we don't want the last 17.
Oh, well, okay,
So
but what's interesting about that? Oh, can you talk a little bit? I mean, was this the only book that you had done that was kind of co-authored that you did it with somebody else as opposed to just
no,
your
I've
own?
done a number of co-authored books, and every single time the arrangement with the co-author is different because it really depends on, are they a writer? Have they ever written anything, or are they the subject? Is it because that was a memoir, really? I was writing a memoir of this other person. And then he wanted his wife to be on her name to be on the cover as well, which is not part of our original deal. So we had three of our names on the cover. But he had brain damage, and so we had to make concessions. And the problem is when you have somebody who has lost his memory, it's kind of hard to write a book about that person's life because you can't interview that person really past a certain point because they don't remember. So I had to go,
Were
interview
there
all these
past
other
interviews,
people.
I'm assuming though, right? Like,
Huh?
I mean, he was as a football player, did he have past interviews? Like, stuff that you could like kind of mine?
Wasn't really that much out there in the public
Yeah.
domain. No, there wasn't. So his wife became actually a pretty important resource. So in the end, I think she earned her way on, with her name on the front of that book because she really had to help recreate for me what their life was like. Because, for example, she had a miscarriage and he didn't remember it. So she had this horrible trauma that she used to share with him, but then he fell down and broke his head open and lost all those memories. And so they lost a lot of shared memories and they had to basically recreate them. So that's what the book ended up being about. So it ended up having, when you look at it as a story arc, you're kind of building towards the climax. We ended up having what I call a double bump. So we had one kind of climax, but it was halfway through the book. Then what do you do? Okay, well, so then we have like a second part of the story. So it was a real challenge to write that book, partly because he had lost his memory and then the editor didn't think the second half of the book was interesting enough. So I had to basically reimagine what would make a more interesting set of the second half of the story, which I did, and it was fine, and it ended up being my New York Times best-selling book, which is I'm really happy about. But it was a journey. It was
Yeah.
definitely a journey. It was a medical story, it was a psychological story, and it was a kind of a love story too. So I mean, it was a fun project, I thought, in terms of the premise.
Yeah. All right, so we want to get to Hooked, but before that, also on your website and your bio page, you have that your most controversial book was Lost Girls. So what can you tell us, like, why would you say that's your most controversial book?
Okay, so you were asking before, do you have to get permission from the families to write the book? In this case, there were two young teenage girls who were raped and murdered in San Diego County. One of the girls' mothers was writing her own book, and the other set of parents basically, so each set of parents had their own reasons for not wanting to cooperate with me. The second set of parents decided that they owned their story. It should be their story to tell. Even though, it was saturated by all these TV programs, for some reason they saw what I was doing as something different. I did reach out, as I always do. Every time I write a true crime book, I always reach out to the families to try to get them to cooperate because I think it makes a better story that way. But I'm also mindful that these people are grieving and they may not want to talk about it. And, I'm a stranger. They don't know me. They don't have to trust me. And if they don't, then they don't. But I have a contract and I have to fulfill it and I have to write the book anyway. So what happened was when the book was coming out, one of the parents, the one who was writing her own book, she launched a campaign to boycott the book based on the idea of the book. It had nothing to do with the actual book, which she had not even read yet. And she got all these people in the community to go on Amazon and give me a 1-star review. So I had a bunch of people who decided that I was a predator and I was basically capitalizing on these girls and their families' tragedy. And I had to just deal with that because I wrote the story just as I always do, as sensitively as I could to the victims. I always pay a tribute to these victims and who they were before they became victims. What did they accomplish? And since they were so young, what were they hoping to be when they grew up, that kind of thing. And I was actually really proud of that book. And I wrote a really positive story about how the sheriff's department handled both of these cases. And anyway, when it came out, I was just personally attacked,
Mm.
my integrity and my reputation. And I had to basically, and I couldn't engage with these parents because you can't do that. They're grieving and you just can't do that. So I had to basically kind of just say, look, these are my intentions. They were all good. And I'm sorry you were upset by the idea of the book, but I did my best to actually try to prevent some tragedy like this from happening again by helping people understand what a sexual predator is, what makes a sexual predator, and what can we do differently to prevent something like this from happening again. And so that's how I handled it. I got more speaking gigs. I was on every single TV show the night of my launch because this woman marched into my book signing with all of these women in orange t-shirts and interrupted my book signing with a protest. But I was on the news on every channel, on top of the news on it. So she ended up not hurting me. And
Mm.
so, but it was very controversial. And then,
Yeah.
the media was capitalizing, oh, there's all this conflict. They're fighting. No, I refused to engage in a fight. I didn't fight with her. I didn't pick a fight. I didn't attack her. I'm sorry for your loss. What can I do?
Yeah.
Right. That was a learning
So,
experience.
so your first book came out in what was it, 2005.
2005.
So
Mhm.
at this point, we're just over
That's
20 years.
2012.
Um, have you now, like you mentioned, I mean, true crime has become much more popular, it seems like, just because of like, true crime documentaries and podcasts. Have you noticed that audience also transferring over to books, or they're just mostly, we just like watching or
No.
listening?
Yeah. The thing about TV is with true crime, people see it on TV, they think they know the case. When in fact, a lot of times those TV shows will call up an author and have them on the show because they're the ones who know the case, not the TV show. The TV show maybe has read your book and then they'll go ahead and put their show together. But you're the one who knows the case. You're the one who's done the research. So I actually ended up being on a lot of TV shows, being interviewed about all the cases I've written about, which was good for me. There were some cases I literally did like 25 different shows. So
Yeah.
that helped me and gave me exposure as an author, and it gave them somebody who was an expert in the case to talk about it on TV. But most of the time it didn't really translate, I don't think, into book sales because it helps you and gets you exposure, but sometimes people want to know more, but a lot of times they just want to watch the TV show.
Yeah. Yeah, I knew this guy who had been in this like independent movie, and the director ended up being involved in this murder first, I think, insurance purposes or whatever. And this guy I knew who had been on the movie, when he and another person made like a documentary about the murder or whatever else. And then they were featured on Dateline. Dateline did, and I think it was Dateline, or one of those shows. Dateline ended up doing like an hour program about this. And I'm thinking like, well, no one's going to want to watch your documentary now because everything is in this is in this Dateline episode. But anyway, yeah, so that's what it is.
But I
So
think
anyway,
I
let's,
think I
yeah.
think documentaries probably will have more information that wouldn't end up in a Dateline show because these Dateline 2020, they actually have pretty strict guidelines in what they will and will not focus on. It has to be
Mm,
like, this is what the prosecutor said, this is what the verdict was, this is what the jury said. And they don't want necessarily a lot of new information that might question or challenge any of that, for example. That
yeah.
happened to me recently. So but
So,
I,
I
I
mean,
have to I have to think that being on 2020 twice, then 3 or 4 million viewers watching me on TV, that must have helped me, right? I would
yeah,
hope.
yeah. Well, yeah, so that's interesting. So with a lot of true crime, I mean, there's just, crime is happening every day. There's always different levels of horrific crime.
Yeah.
Do you like, and this is going to sound maybe a little crass, but like what are the crimes that really pop? You know what I mean? Like what are those things that like really seem to hit hard with audiences versus other crimes, which honestly probably should be more, the public should be aware of, but just do not, like, you know. like going back to like like for whatever, like I'm thinking like the John Benet Ramsey case. Like, had she been just this other girl, you know what I mean? Like, was it because she was
Blonde,
this,
blue
like,
eyes.
yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, does it
that's
really
what
come
America
down to that whole,
wants.
like, the media is always looking for just whoever the prettiest dead girl is,
Yep,
or
pretty much
oh,
missing,
okay, so
or
that is
yep,
really,
that's really unfortunately. But here's an interesting thing. My most popular book that I have written recently kind of broke the mold a little bit. It's called Death on Ocean Boulevard. It came out in 2021 during COVID, during the pandemic. And so I couldn't really do any live events, but I did a lot of podcasts, and there were a number of TV shows on it, which I was on and was interviewed for. This is the Rebecca Zahau case, and she was from Myanmar originally. So she was Asian, which is kind of unusual. She's not the blonde, blue-eyed, victim. But the secret is she had a very rich boyfriend. So in order to have a case that really gets picked up, if there's a rich person in it, that they're questioning, was he involved, that tends to make the story pop, as you say. However, the main thing was that this woman was found hanging naked, bound and gagged, and the sheriff's department ruled that she did it to herself, and pretty much nobody agrees with that. So people just
yeah.
don't believe what the sheriffs did. And I basically wrote a whole book about that. And it went to trial. There was a civil jury. It was a wrongful death case. And they agreed that it was a murder. And the sheriff's department still would not move from its suicide ruling. That is my most popular book recently of all my true crime books, because people just love that story because it makes them so mad. So
Yeah.
that's part of it. They
Yeah,
just
I
can't
don't want
believe she
to.
would do that to herself.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to necessarily disparage the good police officers out there, because I'm sure there are a lot of good police officers. But have you found that oftentimes there's just a lot of police corruption in a lot of these cases, or maybe not necessarily corruption,
Most,
but maybe just like
yeah,
you
I know
know,
what you're saying.
like some ignorant,
Incompetence,
yes, yes,
lack of
incompetence.
thoroughness. Okay, so confirmation bias. So my last two books, my last two crime books are basically, I kind of look at them as part one and part two. Death on Ocean Boulevard would be part one. Down to the Bone, which is the McStay family murder. Family of four mysteriously disappeared from their house in Fallbrook, left eggs out on the counter, coffee in the pot. Their dogs were in the backyard with no food or water. So they just like mysteriously just disappeared in the middle of painting their kitchen, and they just disappeared. And so the sheriff's department, which is the same sheriff's department that investigated the Rebecca Zahau case and said that was a suicide, same homicide unit, um, decided that this family went voluntarily to Mexico. And 9 months after they gave up looking for them, their skeletal remains were found in the desert, and they all had holes in the back of their skulls from a sledgehammer. So they had been out in the desert in these shallow graves for 4 years because the sheriff's department made a bad call. So these two cases are all about confirmation bias, which basically means that these investigators had an idea of what happened and would not move from it, even when they were wrong. So again, not complete investigations, bad decisions, bad judgment, what have you. I wouldn't say it was corruption, but they definitely just would
I
not
mean,
let go
why
of
did
these
they think
ideas that they had.
Mexico? Like, was there something specifically that they thought that all of a sudden they
Yeah,
just
there
went to
was some
Mexico and left their
grainy
dogs behind and
video.
all this
There
stuff?
was some grainy video that these people who look for missing children, they found some video of some people crossing the pedestrian bridge into Tijuana, and they thought that might have been them. And even though there was a father and a mother and then two little boys, 3 and 4 years old, and um, the boys in the family always wore these little beanie caps because one of the little boys had a strawberry birthmark that the mom was trying to cover up. And these kids in the video had on the beanie caps, but the family couldn't see their faces. And the mom also said, that doesn't look like my son. My son walks like a duck. That person doesn't walk like a duck. But they just glommed onto this idea that they went to Mexico. And I think they just really had a feeling that somehow that drugs were involved, even though they had nothing to support that. other than the fact that there was some ecstasy in the freezer.
Yeah.
So
Is that a more of a do you think it's more of like also a generational divide, like older, police officers and detectives who, like technology is advancing? And the reason I'm thinking about it is because there's a recent Stephen Conrad has a new show out, DTF, St. Louis, and one of the characters found dead, and then you have like a very older police detective who immediately assumes like, oh, this is clearly what the reason. You have a younger police detective, being like, no, that it's completely, and so I'm just kind of curious if you notice that sometimes, because with the way things have changed so quickly, with technology
they,
especially, that
I
like,
don't think
people are
that
kind
had
of,
anything to do with it. I
well,
think
not
it had to
necessarily that specific in that case, but I mean, have you noticed that with your other, uh,
no,
you know,
not really.
out and about? Okay.
No, because I mean, some of my other stories that I wrote, the police detectives did a good job, and they put the thing together, and I covered that. So, I mean, I don't go looking for cases where they did not do a good
Right.
job,
And I'm not trying to say
and
that
and
you
it didn't
are.
turn out that they did a bad job. They did a fine job, and these people were all the same age. So, I
Yeah.
mean, they're police in general, though, are not great about technology. I mean, I don't want to say anything that's going to get anybody upset with me, but
No, we don't want to do that. Well, let's go on to your next book. Well,
yeah.
let's go to Hooked. What can you tell us about Hooked? Your first
Okay.
novel, I guess in a while, right?
Took 19 years. So, like I said, it originally was going to be a sequel to Naked Addiction, but then I decided I'm going to create a new female investigative reporter character to go with the surfing homicide detective that I had originally created in Naked Addiction, so they can play off each other. And I kind of feel like the agents that I had, the editors who read it early on, really were not catching on with the idea of having two protagonists. So it, like, detective novels have one detective, and that's kind of what they were used to. So I was doing something kind of different. I wanted to have two characters that were both investigators, but they were kind of working at odds and competing with each other. And they were also attracted to each other, but they were not allowed to date because they're basically both investigating the same case. So you have professional tension and romantic sexual tension all the way through the book, which keeps that dynamic going. Um, so that was kind of the premise that I came up with. So they're investigating these two suspicious deaths that happen in a community, a very wealthy community called La Jolla Farms. So they basically, Katrina Chopin is the woman investigative reporter, and Ken Good is the surfing detective, and they meet each other at a bar beforehand, randomly, and they're very attracted to each other, and they're starting to talk about some shared traumas in their past, suicide, addiction, light stuff like that. And he gets a call, and he's got, oh, I got two dead bodies, I gotta go. So he got her number, and he leaves and doesn't realize she's a reporter until the next morning when she shows up at the news conference with her notebook. And he says, you're a reporter? And she says, yeah. So now they can't date. So it starts out with the push. It's basically push pull, and then they're kind of helping each other in some ways and competing against each other in some ways, and then eventually kind of solve what happened. And then Staged, which is the sequel, literally picks up right where Hooked left off, and the story continues, because as it turns out, it's not as simple as they thought it was, that there are other people involved, and it turns out it's a whole group of people, and they're
Yeah.
getting
Well,
in
we don't
investigating
want to give
them.
away too much about Hooked right
No, but
now
that's
because
basically,
that's the one it is out. But did you know when you were writing Hooked that there was going to be a follow? I mean, was this the intention to have a series?
my intention was to have a series, but I did not know what the second book was going to be about. I just really needed to have a series, because that's what I really had heard. That's how you get successful in fiction. You have to have a series. So I had these characters, and I said, and I'll come up with something. So I spent 19 years working on Hooked. And while my agent was sitting on it, waiting to read it, and Down to the Bone, the McStay case I was just talking about, got held up and was delayed 3 times. The publication date was changed 3 times. I was just sitting at home going insane, going, I've got to do something. So I wrote the sequel. And then by the time that, we were still going, I ended up writing half of book 3 too. That's how long it took to get my 2-book deal. So
And I'm glad it worked out, but I know that other writers have done that and they did not sell that first book. And then they were stuck with a sequel to a book
I
that did
took
not
a
sell.
risk. I took a risk because I would have gone insane if I hadn't, and I'm doing it again. I've got books 3 and 4 under submission, and my editor won't decide on whether she was going to buy the next book in the series until we find out some numbers on how Hooked is going to do. And I'm now working on yet another book with a new character, which is potentially a new series, or it could be a standalone. So that's 3 books that I'm actually taking this risk and writing without a contract, which
Yeah.
I would not recommend to other people, but I don't know what else to do.
I
Can't
mean, as
just
long
sit
as you're
here,
staying busy, I mean, I guess it's better
I
than
have
not
to.
having
Yeah,
any, than not working on anything. So at least you will
I
still
have
have
to.
something there.
This is my job. I don't have another job. So
Yeah. So, all right. So then, well, when you're writing a series, do you like, how do you keep track of all your characters? Do you keep like a character list? And like, when you're working on a third or fourth book, have you created a Bible where you then know that like, oh, oh, this, like, because obviously you don't want to have something happen in book four that's maybe very similar to something happen in book one or two. I mean, like, how are you like keeping track of all of these things?
it's all in here. These characters, the main characters, have been in my head for like 30 years. So I'm not going to forget who they are, what they've done. Although all those different rewrites, there's sometimes I do forget. Did I put that in? Is that in the first book, or did I save that for the second book? So it's more of like plot
Yeah.
components than it is character components that I need to keep track of. So I pretty much know what each book is about. And so the new book that I'm writing, it actually has many fewer characters, that because some of these first couple of books, I had some reviews where I guess people were having a little bit of trouble keeping track of, because there were a lot of characters. This is like brothers and sisters. And
Yeah.
so I know who they are, but that was a little tricky to make sure that the reader could follow along and not forget who everybody was.
Yeah. Well,
But
one
I've got
idea,
it in here.
yeah, as the series grows, I think it was Mark Greaney had said, I don't know if it was one of his when he was doing the Tom Clancy stuff or the Gray Man books, but basically, like every time a new book came out, you get a PDF of whatever else. He would just constantly combine all the PDFs of all the books. So then you could just do a quick search, like, have I used this
Oh, okay.
name before? Have I used, so then that way you're not like reusing someone's name where it was like, no, this person had the same name. So
I
anyway,
have screwed up some names a couple of times. Like when I went from one book to the next book, I remembered the name wrong and I was using a different name for the same character. And then
mm,
thankfully we got all the way to the copy edited and I caught it
yeah,
myself. The copy editor didn't catch it because I don't think they used the same copy editor. So I went back and I did what you said and I did a search and I'm like, oh, so I fixed it,
yeah.
thankfully.
So in the time we have left, I figure I'll just let you go off on the state of journalism nowadays in the United States. You want to do that?
Sure. So I think what I wanted to say is basically that with this series, starting with Hooked, going through to Staged, continuing on through the series, hopefully the rest of it gets published. But basically, I set Hooked in 2015, and I did that because when I was actually writing the final versions that were eventually got published for Hooked, newsrooms no longer existed. So during COVID, a lot of newsrooms closed, papers were sold and folded. And so what we ended up happening is a lot of reporters just working remotely from home. And I wanted to kind of pay an homage and a tribute to old school journalism at the time when we still had bustling newsrooms, because I miss working in that environment. I know a lot of people that I still keep in touch with from my last newspaper that I worked at, which is actually the inspiration for the newspaper in this series. It's literally in the same building that I worked in. I just call it a different, it was the San Diego Union-Tribune. I call it the San Diego Sun-Dispatch in the book, right? So I wanted there to be that camaraderie and that energy in the newsroom, and I wanted the reporters, and specifically Katrina Chopin, my protagonist, to to stand for what I think is kind of gotten lost, the integrity and the ethics and the ability to stand up for telling the truth and not getting attacked for it and being respected for it and not attacked for it. So that's, I want these characters to be good people, as opposed to a lot of the characters you see in crime novels. They're so flawed and they break all the rules. And, my characters really do what's right. And they, get close to the line, and they're not angels, or that would be boring. But I want them to know what's the difference between right and wrong, which I'm not so sure. A lot of people who are working these days in high profile jobs seem to have lost their way.
So you said you set the book in 2015.
And technologically, one thing the
Yeah.
other reason I did that is that was when we were moving from print newspapers to online web-based journalism. So the deadlines changed. For example, you would have a story that would go online at 9 o'clock at night, as opposed to not appearing in the newspaper until the morning.
Mm.
So people would read it right away, and things would happen at night. People get upset even before it hit the newspaper in the morning. And, these days they don't even necessarily run those stories in the paper the next day. Sometimes they are online only, or they wait another week before it ends up in the paper. So it was right in that transition. And that's why I said it at that time, because I still wanted there to be newsrooms. I still wanted there to be bigger staffs. I wanted you to be able to see the editors in their glass offices fighting with each other. And, it was just a whole different time.
Yeah. So where do you think the state of journalism is going to be in like 5 years? Because I mean, I imagine it's definitely going downhill. Or do you think there's going to be a resurgence?
Well, I have always hoped for a boomerang effect, because shrink, 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 shrink. What's happening is I'm hoping people are realizing that we need journalists to keep our politicians honest, because look what happens when we don't have watchdog journalism. We don't have enough people covering what we used to. I mean, there's just not enough bodies. They can't cover all the news that is happening,
Yeah.
or all the reporters they have are focusing on one thing. I mean, it's just totally different today, the way that they approach covering the news. And that there's still a lot of news outlets that are trying to do this fair and balanced stuff. You can't do that when people are just lying all the time. You can't cover liars the same way that you cover people who maybe, have different opinions. Like we were talking before we went on record, these alternative facts, you've got to cover that differently. And I think that we've kind of just lost our way. Even the New York Times, I feel, soft pedals a lot. I mean, I
Yeah.
read these stories sometimes and they're just really soft in how they're describing something, when to me it's much more extreme and clear, that you could describe it in a much more black and white way, and they don't. Because they don't want to get attacked, they don't want to get sued. I don't know what the reason is, but it just doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem accurate to me either.
Yeah. No, I mean, and this is obviously a much longer discussion, but I
Yeah.
think that yeah, I mean, there's definitely you have certain news play. I mean, look at the Washington Post. I mean,
Yeah.
God, I mean, the Washington Post used to be the paper. I mean, they took down Nixon, and now it's
Sad.
essentially
Sad.
appeasing
I
a
know.
corrupt
I know.
president. So it's
Well, and all this stuff about, oh, we're not going to endorse. Well, that's what newspapers have always done. So I don't, and
well,
the
do you think
appeasing
this
the
goes back to
billionaires
mostly
and
just like
all that.
I mean, essentially a lot of these newspapers are just being like bought up by like, billionaires
Hedge
who clearly
funds
have
and
their
hedge
own,
funds.
yeah, who like
Yeah.
have their own then like, business in front of powerful people. And so it's not like back in the day where they were still obviously owned by rich people, but I guess they were as easy. Well, I mean, you even go back to like, like look at Citizen Kane and like Hearst and all of that. I mean, it's been an ongoing thing, but it seems like it's just gotten worse.
So in Hooked, for example, I actually touch on this. So even though it's in 2015 and it's before it got as bad as it is now, I still have a publisher who's a rich businessman, and he's definitely trying to protect his friends, and he's definitely not thinking about ethics, and he's definitely not trying to do the right thing. So you have Katrina, who's going up against the publisher and her editors, and they're like, trying to tell the publisher that he can't make these certain decisions to protect certain people because the Poynter Institute's going to get a hold of this story and they're going to basically ruin the reputation of everybody who works at the paper. And so that's the only thing that he will actually listen to. So I even go into that in the book where there are these ethical battles about having business owners running a newspaper because they are not there to do the community service that newspapers are really created to do. You know, we are there to tell the truth and do watchdog journalism to keep the politicians honest. And these hedge funds are not there for that reason. They are there to try to make money and to drain whatever money they can get out of whatever's left of these companies. And they don't care about the quality of the journalism that's coming out of them. That's not why they bought them. They are buying them to try to make whatever money they can. And they don't care what those consequences are. And that's the problem, is that's why we have more nonprofit organizations who are starting to run newspapers and news outlets, even though they're small, because that they're the ones who have the right idea about what we're supposed to be doing as journalists and how we're supposed to be covering what's going on in our community. We're not there to make money. And that's the problem. And that's the inherent conflict with trying to run a media organization, is because they do still have to operate. You know, it costs money to run a business. And like the guy who owns the New York Times, he looked like he was going to spend all kinds of money to run this great thing. And no, he's pulling money out of it all the time and shrinking because he just doesn't want to lose all that money.
Yeah. Yeah. And
It's
I
sad,
think,
but that's kind of the reality.
yeah. And I think that one of the, excuse me. I think one of the other issues is that you just, have a number of people who just don't really care, again, about the alternative facts. Like, even if clearly this is the truth, he doesn't care because like they already have preconceived notions or,
Right.
yeah, there's a lot of different
Fake
media
news,
bubbles.
misinformation, disinformation, and there's a lot of partisan media outlets that are not telling objective journalism. They're touting ideological, memes and tropes and political talking points from one party.
Yeah.
That's really good at doing that one party.
Well, and it's crazy that like when some of these news organizations get sued for billions of dollars,
Uh-huh.
they then continue to lie about other things. Like they don't learn their lesson. Anyway, like I said, this is a much longer conversation. I don't want to go into it. But again, the new novel, Hooked, if you want to hold it up, congratulations on that. People can find that on
Thank you.
Amazon as an ebook, as a paperback, as an
And
audiobook. And the
and
new one,
stage the sequel.
when is Staged coming out? If people want to pre-order that.
June 16th. Yes, and it is available for pre-order.
Perfect. So, and then what I always like to end with, is there anything you've read, listened, watched recently that you would recommend that you enjoyed?
Oh, that's tough. I tend to watch a lot of limited series, and I can't think of one that I really liked off the top of my head because all that doesn't mean I haven't seen any that I've liked. But oh, you know what? Okay, here's one: Drops of God. It's all about wine, the wine industry, and it's fascinating because I like going wine tasting. I can't drink that much anymore, but it's just I've learned so much, and it's so well done, and it's on Apple. Drops of God, super
Yeah, no, that's in
interesting,
second season now. I have heard good things about it. Is one of those
so
things that
good,
initially I was like,
so
I
good.
want to watch a show about wine, but I hear it's much more than that.
Oh, it's very multi-layered and the plot is really interesting. And I don't want to go into it because you have to watch it, but it's fascinating. It's about the wine industry, but it's so much more. Yeah, it's so much more than that. It's about family and betrayal and all kinds of other stuff too.
And it's based on a graphic novel, which I find is
Oh,
interesting for
isn't
that
it?
type of thing. I'm pretty sure it
Oh,
is. Yeah.
well, it is very
Um,
visual. That's interesting you say that. I was thinking, because there's this one character, she actually can see what she's tasting. Like she visualizes it in a way, which I just think is fascinating.
hmm,
The notes to the wine. She can taste these little tastes that, winemakers can identify that you and I may not be able to identify, like leather and,
yeah.
mineral and, you know,
Okay.
weird stuff that they come up with.
And then if people want to like stalk you online, where's the best way they can do that?
I have a website, CaitlinRother.com. You can contact me through there. And I'm also on all the primary social media and happy to engage. So please contact me if you want to send a copy of a book as well, or have me on a podcast or event or come speak or anything like that. Because I
All
got to
right,
sell
perfect.
those. Thank you
Absolutely.
so much for
So,
having me on. I appreciate it.
yeah. And then do you have any, so you have stages coming out. Do you have any nonfiction in the works or anything that's people should be on the lookout for?
I'm taking a break from nonfiction, but I do have books that I have. I've got 4 books coming out in 15 months, and I have not been able to promote them all as well as I normally would because they came out so close together. So I do have 2 from last year that I would love to share, and that's Body Parts, which is a story of a serial killer who turned himself in. And I just recently updated it with 10,000 new words because they just identified his first victim through genetic genealogy. So this poor woman had been dismembered and they didn't have her head. They didn't know who she was. So 25 years later, she gets her name back. Her family gets closure. So that's Body Parts. And then the second one is the McStay book called Down to the Bone. And I didn't get a chance to really promote that well before I'm, all of a sudden having to promote Hooked and Staged. So
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this because you've dealt with a lot of true crime. Serial killers are are there are there still a lot of serial killers out there nowadays, or was it just more hyped up back in like the 70s? Like, like has technology made it harder for people to these serial killers to exist? Because I always feel like I always have this conversation with my agent where it's like, like I wrote a book called The Serial Killer's Wife, one of my probably my most successful books, very popular because I think it's, because readers love serial killers, but realistically, I'm like, how common are serial killers? Like, you read like James Patterson novel or Michael Connelly, there's always like these serial killers, but it's like just I don't know. For me, I kind of find it difficult to write because it's like, how realistic is it for, all these serial killers out and about?
my character, he's a real person. His name is Wayne Adam Ford, and he was a long haul trucker. Now, there are probably a lot of serial killers who are truckers because and do not get caught because they are crossing state lines all the time, right?
Yeah.
And he would pick up a woman in one place, rape her in his truck, drive her hundreds and thousands of miles or cross state lines and put her in a body of water someplace. Those women were not, he was not on anybody's radar. He turned himself in. That's the only reason they were able to identify who those women were and that he was the one who killed them, because otherwise he would have gone completely unnoticed and he wouldn't have gotten caught. So they're
Mm.
like the truckers. I think there are probably quite a few truckers who are probably serial killers and they never get caught. And so they know there's like 40 women. And the other thing is if they're prostitutes, it's like they don't get the attention. They're not John Bonet. They're not, these blonde, blue-eyed, Gabby Petito, whatever. They they don't get noticed. If they're Native American or of people of color, women of color, the police aren't really chasing them, and the lower socioeconomic levels of women, nobody's missing them that much. And they're on drugs or they're prostitutes and nobody's really putting focus on that. So I think there's still serial killers and there were serial killers. I have no way of knowing that there are more or less than there used to be, but I can't imagine there would be fewer serial killers. Why would there be fewer today than there used to be? I don't know,
Well, I
but
guess they're more famous, or you'd have a lot of more sensationalized serial killers back in the day. But I would think like nowadays, just with the overabundance of just our nanny state of just security cameras everywhere, it has to be more difficult
yeah,
as opposed to you mentioned truck stop. I mean, there's cameras all over those truck stops, as opposed to back in the day, there might be an old
but
camera
they're
that
not
was
killing them in the
there.
truck stop. They're
Well, I meant
they're
though abducting them though, like the last scene. Again, I'm just saying like I just feel like there's so many more security cameras, like even on the highways everywhere, that like police in theory could easily track down if someone gets abducted or disappears, whereas opposed to like 30 years ago, like again, a
think
trucker could
you're
go across the
applying
country and not
logic.
be seen.
You're applying logic to something that may not really apply because you've got people who are still they still have these urges There's
Yeah.
just the reason they're serial killers, or and they've killed 40 women, is because they haven't gotten caught and they keep killing.
Yeah.
And they're not getting caught because they're not all in one jurisdiction, so that the local police can't find a pattern. Do you
Yeah.
see what I mean? That's what I think is happening.
Yeah.
So like
Like
the
there
Golden
was,
State Killer was killing people up and down California in a lot of different counties. The only reason that they ended up catching him is because of this forensic, genetic genealogy, and they started using that to catch him. That to me is fascinating, but they couldn't catch him until they started using that as a tool to try to link some of these cases. And that's how they eventually caught him, is through genetic genealogy.
I thought it was Patton Oswalt's wife is how he got caught.
No.
Is that I'm joking?
And
Um,
then she died before he was caught. But
the book though had come out at that point though, right? Or no, 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 no. The book came out after she had passed away. Well, let's not talk about that. But it reminds me too of there was a Netflix show came out a couple years ago. It was based on a true story where it was killers operating in different, I guess, counties or whatever else. And the only reason they were able to was one cop ended up talking to another cop because they realized that those police, those that they didn't
well,
really share
okay,
that information.
let's talk about the Manson case. The reason the Manson case took as long as it took to get solved was because you had the LAPD and the LA County Sheriff's Department working on different murders and different cases, and they were not sharing information. And that's why the family went undiscovered and they kept killing people, because these police officers were not talking to each other. I wrote a
Yeah.
book about that. And so it's all explained in there, that if these different jurisdictions, they don't share information. That's why these people don't get caught, and that's why the killers move around, and that's why they don't get caught.
All right. On that note, it was very nice chatting with you. Again, the
You
latest book is
too.
called Hooked. The upcoming book is called Staged, which you can pre-order now. So, Caitlin, again, thank you so much for hanging. We went way over, so I don't want to keep much more of your time. So, again, thank you,
This is
and
great.
we'll see everybody
Thank
next
you.
time. Yep. Bye.
Okay.